In the last video, part 4, we have seen Mr. Harriet, the veterinary surgeon, examining the dog, Roy. And then he said that the dog will be lovely golden retriever because there is potential in him, and for that he needs good food, good shampoo, and strong condition powders. Let's see who is going to provide these things to dog in this video. Let's start.
Look, she said excitedly, pointing to a name roughly scratched on the collar. His name's Roy. She smiled up at me. It's a bit like Rex, isn't it? That name? You know, Mrs. Donovan. Now you mention it, is it? It's very like Rex, the way it comes off your tongue. I nodded seriously. She stood silent for a few moments, obviously in the grip of a deep emotion. Then she burst out, "Can I have him? I can make him better. I know I can. Please, please, let me have him." "Well, I don't know," I said. "It's really up to the inspector. You'll have to get his permission."
So here, once again, the author, James Harriet, has introduced Mrs. Donovan. She is already started working for dog. She was examining him inside the shed. Now as Mr. Harriet came inside the shed, Mrs. Donovan looked at Mr. Harriet. She was excited and she pointed out to the dog and said to Mr. Harriet, "Sir, dog's name is Roy. It is written on his collar." Probably her sadness was over, and so she smiled at Mr. Harriet and said, "Sir, that dog is a bit like Rex, isn't it?" Now, there is conversation between Mrs. Donovan and Mr. Harriet. Mr. Harriet knew how to advise the people who lost their animals. So he told her, "Mrs. Donovan, it's like Rex. It will become lovely golden retriever. As a vet, I have already examined him. He is really like Rex, that you can only have him." Mr. Harriet shook his head up and down seriously. Children, remember, Mr. Harriet once advised to Mrs. Donovan to keep another dog after her terrier dog's death. She had denied him, saying that terrier dog was everything for her. It meant too much for her. Another dog can't take the place of Rex. But after 1 month, there is drastic transformation, drastic change in the attitude of Mrs. Donovan. She had deep love, emotion for Roy, and then she burst out, "Sir, please give me that dog right to me. Here burst out means Mrs. Donovan spoke loudly with strong feeling for dog Roy. Sir, please let me keep that dog. I can make him better. I am 100% sure I can make him good. I can heal him. Sir, please, please let me take that dog. That is what she pleaded to Mr. Harriet. Did she get the dog or not? Let's see. And then Mr. Harriet said, I don't know, Donovan. It's not in my hand. I can't give you the dog. The inspector would decide. He would give you or not. It's in his hand. I can't. Therefore, please ask permission from the Inspector Halliday of RSPCA, and then only I can give you this dog.
Halliday looked at her in bewilderment. Then he said, Excuse me, madam, and drew me to one side. We walked a few yards through the long grass and stopped under a tree. Mr. Harriet, he whispered, I don't know what's going on here, but I just can't pass over an animal in this condition to anybody who has a casual whim. The poor beggars had one bad break already. I think it's enough. This woman doesn't look like a suitable person. I held up a hand. Believe me, Inspector, you have nothing to worry about. She's a funny old stick, but she's been sent from heaven today. If anybody in Darubi can give this dog a new life, it's her.
The Inspector Halliday was listening to what Mrs. Donovan and Mr. Harriet were talking about, listening the wish of keeping the dog Roy by Mrs. Donovan. Suddenly, the inspector looked at her in bewilderment. Here, bewilderment means the inspector was in complete confusion whether to give the dog to Mrs. Donovan or not in that miserable condition. And he told her, I am extremely sorry, madam. I can't give you that dog to you. Probably he didn't know about Mrs. Donovan. He thought that she wouldn't treat the dog well. He refused to give the dog to Mrs. Donovan. And then the inspector took Mr. Harriet under a tree. And what did he do there with him? Did the inspector ask Mr. Harriet about Mrs. Donovan? Let's see what happens next. So here the inspector spoke quietly to Mr. Harriet under a tree. What did he speak about? Halliday told to Mr. Harriet, I can't just pass over this dog to anybody. Here, pass over means to give. The inspector said to Harriet, I can't give that dog Roy to Mrs. Donovan in such a miserable condition. How can I trust her? She suddenly wished to keep that dog. How can she have casual whim suddenly? Here, whim means sudden wish to keep the dog. That poor dog had bad break already. Here, bad break means the dog Roy had already very bad situation. He was about to die. How can I trust her? The inspector said that lady Mrs. Donovan is not an appropriate lady to keep the dog. And how can she take care of that dog? This is what the inspector said to Mr. Harriet under the tree softly, so that Mrs. Donovan couldn't hear them. If the inspector didn't give the dog Roy to Mrs. Donovan, then whom did he give? Let's see what happens next. So here, there is a conversation among the inspector, Halliday, Mr. Harriet and Mrs. Donovan. But at present, Mr. Harriet and the inspector are speaking. So here, Mr. Harriet, the veterinary surgeon, caught inspector's hand and said to him, Inspector, trust me. You don't have to worry about anything. Though Mrs. Donovan looks a funny old stick, she has been sent from heaven today. Here, stick means not a thin piece of wood, but it means a person. Sir, we are fortunate that Mrs. Donovan is here today. You don't have any idea about her. She is the one who can give new life to Roy. Believe. Did Mr. Harriet convince the inspector of RSPCA whether Mrs. Donovan could give new life to that dog Roy or not? Let's see what happens next.
Halliday still looked very doubtful, but I still don't get it. What was all that stuff about him needing shampoos and condition powders? Oh, never mind about that. I'll tell you some other time. What he needs is lots of good grub, care and affection, and that's just what he'll get. You can take my word for it. All right, you seem very sure. Halliday looked at me for a second or two, then turned and walked over to the eager little figure by the shed.
The inspector RSPCA didn't believe in Mr. Harriet. He had doubt in him. And he told him what was that good shampoos and strong condition powders that the dog need. I don't understand about those two stuff. What stuff? Here stuff is thing or substance. Inspector had heard about them from Mr. Harriet, but he didn't understand about them. Mr. Harriet told to Halliday, "Sir, don't worry about dog shampoos and condition powders. I would tell you about them some other time." And he told him that the dog Roy needs a lot of good grub. Here, grub means food. He needs a lot of good food, care, and affection. That's it. And the dog would become well. Believe me, sir, it's my promise. Till now, the inspector and Mr. Harriet were speaking under the tree. After their conversation, the inspector of RSPCA went back to the shed again, where Mrs. Donovan was standing. And then he believed in Mr. Harriet, and then he gave the dog Roy to Mrs. Donovan, who wanted to have him. So here the dog Roy is given to Mrs. Donovan. And after that, what did she do with the dog Roy? We shall see in the next video.